There he is.
Hi, Joe.
Jim, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Look at all those books and records.
This is my the students gave me an article last semester about the use of the pretentious bookcase in Zoom meetings. So
it makes it look like you're active and busy. So
yeah.
So on the occasion of code practice certain objects and certain systems, we're here talking with Jim Woodfill about this series of work. And right now, we're in the fall of 2020, and the work is at the gallery projected, and it's also online with an interactive portion that can be used as well. So welcome, Jim.
Hi, Joe. Good to be here.
How goes the semester so far in this interesting time?
Yeah, it's going well. You know, we're doing a lot of virtual meetings. The students are in their studios at school, and they seem to like the different kinds of freedom that they're getting out of the semester. So it's going well.
Good. Glad to hear it. It's new frontier. So
it is. You know, we wrote in the statement for the online show about the discord caused by online presence and online communication, and it's nice to kind of recognize that doing so much virtual computer interaction with students is taxing. It wears you out a little bit more than a normal conversation does. So it's nice to be aware of those things.
And that kind of leads right into the difference between exhibiting art with visitors in front of it and exhibiting art online. And unlike a lot of other artists, you've come up with a different way to kind of relate your work in this format, which is really interesting. We back up briefly and just have you talk about what we had intended and where we ended up, and then talk about, maybe both bodies of work a bit.
Yeah. So last year, on a sabbatical, a semester-long sabbatical from teaching, I really concentrated on work for a couple of shows that we had planned. One here in Kansas City at the Drawing Room, and then that same show was going to move to Duluth to your gallery in the summer. And the body of work kind of was a continuation of some things that I'd been working on, but really a highly focused set of experiments with color and structure in ways that I hadn't worked with for quite some time. So it resulted in a body of work that I referred to as code practice that contained a lot of kind of painting, sculpture hybrids, and some video animation within that work that was part of that. And I'm looking around the studio to kind of see if I can give a better description of it, but it resulted in a show of a more kind of traditional individualized works than I've normally been doing in the last 10 or 12 years. I've been more concentrating on installation oriented works, and so that's the kind of the background of what the work was.
And certainly you make a good point there. Your installation work you know, if it wants to be collected, let's say,
Yeah.
it was kind of, it would take a special institution, a special person, so maybe somebody with space. And it could be that if you just pulled out a piece, it was completely out of context and maybe didn't even make sense. And as you point out, some of these objects you've made with code practice can stand on their own, it seems, or in different combinations.
The sculptures themselves are more autonomous than most, and I often make individual objects that go into installations, but I think more of them as tools for a kind of stagecraft where the installation is the final composition. And these are a little more towards kind of individualized works. And I'm not sure I could tell you exactly why I moved in that direction, but as it turns out, that focus kind of led me back into thinking about installation in a whole different kind of way. When we decided to think about an online exhibition, I was really kind of jumping all over the place in my mind about what that might be. The idea of the paintings or sculptural hybrids that made up code practice had to do with a three-dimensionality that really pointed out the kinetic nature of walking past a work or just kind of moving your head a little bit and seeing kind of the liveliness of a color appearing from behind something, and that sort of thing. And so I have a history of working with kinetic art, and you've shown an awful lot of that in your gallery over the years. And this work was kind of a push to make the kinetic element of the work be the viewer themselves. And when we started thinking about the online version of what this show might be, my concern really quickly became that emphasis, one of the fundamental emphasis areas of code practice was that kinetic element, and that we would lose that completely by showing these works through photography. So
Yeah,
that
folks in front of the computer screen aren't moving around to look behind or in front of or letting things reveal themselves. So it is quite a challenge.
and unless you're doing some sort of three-dimensional mimicry and modeling in that flat computer space, you don't have that opportunity to kind of look around something as you do in real space. So that concerned us, and you and I talked about that, I think, and the ultimate result was that we decided it was a good idea to concentrate on the animated parts of the work, which I had done some with code practice. There were kind of color studies, and to see if that was a way of allowing kind of a different kind of direct kinetic impact on the viewer.
Then, you know, you're making the viewer, if nothing else, the eyes have to be active to look back and forth to make relationships or find things discordant or whatever they're going to do. There's just not one thing to look at. So I think,
yeah. And so the pairings or in some instances, in some of the videos, the the 2x2 grids of these different animations that are happening. And the animations being simply kind of loops that are repetitive patterns that have a relationship in a general sense with the sound that accompanies them. It's pattern versus pattern, or pattern next to pattern, and those patterns at different rates of movement kind of form these mental mores that happen. I've always been interested. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite parts of the animations are this amplifier cover that moves around, that has holes on both sides, and you can see the mores from the two perforated panels moving across each other, and that kind of acts as a clue for how you might start thinking about sound waves and the interaction of different sounds, the action of different visual elements at the same time. That moire of thinking of that in a sound kind of way was fundamental to a show we did 20 years ago in your gallery in Kansas City, Harmony, with the rotating amplifiers with tones, and that has been kind of a fundamental way of for me to start thinking about sound as a drawing, and sound as a definer of space, and those kinds of things. So I brought that to bear on this exhibition as well, I think.
For folks that want to learn more about that exhibition, Jim has a good view of it on his website. But basically, the viewer was active then because each rotating tone generator stand had a different tone, and you would basically stand where you wanted to get the combination of sounds, either blending or some other way. So as a viewer, you moved around until you kind of found the sweet spot, in a sense. Or you moved around all over just to see what the different effects were. So very much an example of what Jim talks about with an active viewer.
It's a way for, in a subtle sense, for the viewer to have agency, and the viewer to kind of have control and definition over specifically what their experience is. And we looked for ways that might happen. It certainly happens in an exhibition in a room with sculptures or paintings on a wall, where you can, we take that for granted, that we can stand in front of a painting however long we want and then move to the next one. And we have that freedom to kind of construct that visual experience through time for ourselves when we're in a gallery. We wanted to somehow offer that kind of first principle. So we started working on an interactive part of this exhibition, and it was kind of the fundamental part that drove the whole thing. Some of the limits led us to, especially with not being able to do the interactive part on a cell phone, led us to include some more traditional animation films, and there are 3 of those on the site, and I'm really proud of those works as well. And then there was a 4th that was included in the gallery that's not available online. But they all operate like a kit of parts. So we have 8 different pairs of images that each have a sound associated with them, and you can see those at different times in different orders and different relationships on the screen. and it allows the viewer that same kind of idea of how long they want to watch one of these videos versus others. Trains going by in my studio, so we'll hear the hear the horn. This is the moment when I'm teaching virtually to students where my students kind of roll their eyes and go get a cup of coffee when
they're used to it.
They're used to it. Yeah. But so that idea of allowing the viewer the opportunity to orchestrate was really important in this installation, in this online installation. And I think we worked it out really well. It was certainly a labor of love between you and me and Nick, trying to figure out the logistics and the structure of it online. But it works so nicely, and it's somewhere between kind of melancholy and playful, at the same time. And I think that melancholy comes out of a sense of kind of the loneliness of the individual object in its animated state.
And one thing that we might remind folks of is these are not only visual, but you have a sound component that's unique that goes with each one. You might talk a little bit about how you thought about that, how you arrived at those. And in a sense, you could interpret some of the sounds as a little bit melancholy. Others are very active. Some of them are almost like conversations. And the other thing I was just going to say was, with a lot of Jim's work, the shadow is as important as maybe the object that's making the shadow, or at least the way I see it. So that really comes out in these works also.
I think that's right. And I go back again to Harmony, the show in Kansas City 20 years ago, to think about how I was thinking about the sound, because the sound started to come about out of this interactive idea, so that when a viewer would pick a particular video, it would have a sound with it. And how was I going to compose a soundscape that was so randomized, yet maintained some sort of harmonic structure that made sense, that where I could control the amount of kind of harmony versus dissonance, and kind of set the tone for what I wanted the soundscape to do. And so I moved my desks and tables around. I actually acquired a small new little synthesizer to start making sounds with, and it was such a wonderful kind of summer of sitting in front of a synthesizer, watching these animated loops and finding sounds that I thought might not that they matched the video, but they accompanied the video in conversation. And then I would record one of those and put it on another computer and watch it with an animation and play with another sound. And I built up a huge library of different sounds, and a pretty big library of different kind of animated loops. And these all became the toolkit for the installation. So you'll see different combinations of that have the different views of different kinds of animations, and maybe the same animation in one situation and put in another situation in a different video. So Some of them were used over and over, and some of them show up and appear once. The same with the sounds.
And that's very similar way of working that you would with physical objects as well.
It is that I developed with a number of shows that I did really specifically around the turn of the century. One was Harmony, another at your gallery before that was Whirl, and several others, Tone Spools, and a number of those are on my website, that where I devised the tool, the individual sculpture, and then I took all the tools to the site, and then I composed, and a very theatrical way of working, and it also has a deep-rooted connection to my love of rock and roll bands and the equipment that. And when I was young, the guitars and amps and mic stands and going to band practice was the fun of it for me, was carrying all the equipment around and setting up and having all the chords and all of that. And you can see that in my work still to this day. And I think you see speakers and monitors and amplifier carcasses and all kinds of stuff in my in my animations that are, and even the way that I was building sculptures to start to kind of mimic. Some of them are on speaker stands, and
right.
Yeah, the two sculptures that accompanied the video in your gallery when it was out in the front space, the rotating light pieces and then the other box piece, were on speaker stands, and they were meant to kind of address visually the kind of space that a speaker would address an audience.
For those that haven't been to Jim's studio or seen one of his exhibitions, there's often speaker parts, electronic parts, often repurposed in a sense or re-evaluated for what possibilities they have.
Reevaluated is a great word. I love that. Disabled, re-enabled, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I guess what I noticed, and it's funny that as I talk about this, I spend as much time talking about 20-year-old work as I talk about this work, because all of this work. I had a full summer, a sabbatical, and then a winter break. So almost 9 months of continuous work in the studio, which I hadn't had for a decade or more. I used to be in my studio daily, working daily all the time before I started teaching. But so I found myself spending a lot of time looking at images of old work, of even all the way back, and I recently I moved my studio down to the West Bottom. So during that move, also there was a kind of a digging up of old work and old images, and kind of reevaluating some of those things, reassessing them, taking a new look at some of those old works, and realizing that, as an artist, you go down these paths, and often that bifurcates, and you take this path to the right instead of this one to the left, and it felt like a good time to go back and pick up some of those paths that I let go of at different times, and one of those was working with color in a really straightforward, kind of dynamic way, And so code practice became a way of looking at color and remembering how excited I was about it 40 years ago. And the animations became about looking at work 20 and 30 years ago or 10 years ago. So it was a kind of a reevaluation and a return of sorts for me. So the work, although it's brand new and I've never done anything exactly like it, it harkens back to a lot of the concerns that I've had over the years, and it feels like an old friend in many ways.
We might talk a little bit about color, and just for folks that don't know, Jim is a professor in the painting department of the Kansas City Art Institute, and yet he doesn't necessarily make paintings in the traditional sense. And also his use of color perhaps is not, it is looked at a little differently than maybe a typical painter might. Yeah. So I'm sure your classes are interesting, but you might just talk a little bit about how you think about being a painting professor versus what artwork you actually make.
Yeah, I developed some, I'm also a graduate of that painting department.
Yes, painting. Yes.
And I believe that early on, I as a student, I was navigating my way around a department that was wide open on one side and relatively traditional on the other, and trying to find my way through that, and so I ended up really defining painting in a particular way for myself, based on a lot of the work that was influential to me at the time. Not only the kind of high modernism like Ellsworth Kelly and Judd and people like that, but also kind of a branch of painting that dealt with painting as object more specifically. And Ed Moses, Sam Gilliam, some different artists that really resonated with me about how they thought about painting as this expansion. And I was hired so I follow that played out to where eventually the difference between painting and sculpture became really irrelevant to me. That kind of classification didn't seem to have much to do with how I made decisions about making art, and ultimately was hired back into that department for those very reasons, that I brought a view of painting as in a very broad way as the act of building compositions. And you can build compositions with paint, you can build them with wood, you can build them with ideas, you can build them with video, you can build them with anything. But there's a sense about how to kind of and I ultimately build them within rooms instead of on canvases and that kind of thing. So that idea of painting as an expanded field, which is a kind of a play on words from Rosalind Krauss's Sculpture in the Expanded Field, about how the definitions and the rigid boundaries of what painting might be have kind of dissolved. They're there to use if they're useful, but if they're in the way, they're in the way, and you can move out. In the painting department that I teach in, we often have a lot of animation. It's it's one of the kind of the natural forays out of drawing into a more theatrical arena. Color becomes, for me, and always has been, more of a material than a tool for rendering or a tool for representation. It offers, and therefore, whether it's paint or whether it's a material like a found piece of plastic or an amplifier cover or a television monitor, the color of the light on the screen, color as a material or as an occurrence can have many different origins, and the relationship between a piece of painted wood and the blue of a black and white video monitor is a very potent color relationship and so that is part of how I think about color as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for explaining that.
It took a long time, but